Welcome to the Pastor's Pulse for March 9th, 2022. This is part 3. The third major view on the identity of the sons of God and daughters of men in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is what we might call the despotic ruler's position. In this view, the sons of God is a title taken by human rulers or judges who had become wealthy and extremely powerful and may have even begun to see themselves as in some sense divine. These tyrants, it is supposed, began to build great harems for themselves, taking multitudes of the daughters of men for their own possession in order to build up their dynasties and make great names for themselves. A couple of observations from the text lend credibility to this view. First, Moses says this scenario happened when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. It is difficult to see the point of this statement if one adopts the angels as sons of God view or the Cainite versus Sethite view. What does the multiplication of humanity have to do with the angels? Would the sheer number of women on the earth make any difference in attracting angels to lust after them? And if Moses' purpose is to illustrate the corruption of the godly line of Seth with that of Cain, what does the earth's growing population have to do with it? On the other hand, if the issue is the rapidly growing human population coming under the dictatorship of a handful of powerful men who are heaping wives unto themselves, then this comment about the growth of humanity, and especially their daughters, would be relevant and meaningful. The second point is that verse 2 says, not only the sons of God saw the daughters of men and noted their beauty, but they took for themselves wives of all whom they chose. This appears to be emphasizing that it was not the fact of marriage between the sons of God and daughters of men that was significant, but the nature of those marriages, and more specifically, the number. These men were not satisfied with the creation designed for marriage. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Instead, they sought to redefine marriage after their own selfish and sinful desires, following the example of Lamech, Cain's descendant, and yet building upon and magnifying his sin greatly. Where Lamech had 2 wives in violation of God's good design, these despots chose wives for themselves of all they desired from among the daughters of men. One advantage of this view is that it explains the rationale for the flood in terms that are quite consistent with the overarching context of the opening chapters of Genesis. Up to this point in history, God had designed only one institution, that of marriage, and it is precisely that institution which was being completely dismantled by man before the flood. Therefore, God sent the flood to put an end to this rampant abuse and corruption of his glorious institution. Now, polygamy obviously still existed after the flood, and even today. But after the flood, there was the added institution of human government, so there would be a check on the abuses of the marital institution, thus preventing a return to the situation of worldwide corruption that made the flood necessary. What does this mean for the identity of the giants, or Nephilim, in verse 4? If the sons of God were great rulers who sought to establish dynasties, similar, for instance, to Cain's building of a city which he named after his son Enoch in chapter 4, verse 17, then their sons would have been born into positions of great influence and power. It is not difficult to imagine the sons of these men being called mighty ones and men of renown, as Moses does in verse 4. But what about the term giants? Doesn't that suggest these were something other than normal human beings? Not necessarily. First of all, in the context of verse 4, the word Nephilim is parallel to 2 other terms, mighty one and men of renown. This helps us to understand what was significant about them. Not that they were somehow superhuman, but that they were men who demonstrated valor in battle and earned great reputations for themselves. Whatever else this word may signify, the fact that Moses calls them men specifically, men of renown, ought to at least give us pause before we would accept a supernatural identification. And it's not certain at all that the word giant is right here. Milton Fisher, in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, says the word Nephilim, that, quote, the translation giants is supported mainly by the Septuagint and may be quite misleading. The word may be of unknown origin and mean heroes or fierce warriors, etc. The Revised Standard Version and New International Version transliteration Nephilim is safer and may be correct in referring to the noun to a race or nation. End quote. In other words, we should not put too much weight on the use of the word giants in some translations. Context seems like a better guide here than anything else. Now, some would respond to this view by saying that it introduces a novel use of the phrase sons of God, which is contradicted by the clear and obvious uses in Job 1:6, 2:1, and 38:7, referring to angels. But we've already shown that those verses must be interpreted and may or may not refer to angels. It will not do to simply assume one view is correct and then use it to attack the legitimacy of other views, unless you have strong evidence in support. And there doesn't seem to be any such evidence available for angels as sons of God in Genesis 6. In fact, there are several references in the Old Testament to men who served as judges or magistrates by the Hebrew word Elohim or God. For instance, Exodus 21:6 says of a Hebrew servant who chooses servitude rather than liberty when his period of service is complete, quote, then his master shall bring him to the judges, or Elohim. You can look at also Exodus 22 verses 8 and 9, and Psalm 82, 1 and 6. Using the expression sons of God to refer to human judges or rulers is not necessarily a novel concept. Some will object to this view on the grounds that it doesn't take into account the statements in 2 Peter 2 verse 4 and Jude 6 about the angels who sinned. But this, again, is no real criticism, because we don't need to explain later texts in order to interpret an earlier one. All that must be true is that our view of Genesis 6 does not contradict what is said elsewhere in Scripture. And the despotic ruler's position does not in any way deny that angels sinned, left their own abode, and are held in chains of darkness awaiting the judgment. With no view being absolutely certain, we'll have to be satisfied with the least bad one, which in my opinion is this third and final position.